Great. So thank you everyone for joining. We really have a fantastic panel of real world leading experts on oil, who, as I mentioned, I've been reading since I was an undergraduate, and it's very exciting to get their views. And it's obviously a very good time to have this event, as we don't have white smoke coming out of the OPEC meeting. There's a lot going on, demand destruction, OPEC plus cuts. There's a lot going on in the world of oil. And this obviously has huge implications for the Middle East and for the entire world. So it's a very timely topic, and it's a real world-class panel that we're really honored to have. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Dr.-John Sfakyanakis, who is a member of the MENAF Advisory Board and the Master of Ceremonies, and I hope a participant as well today in today's conversation. So thank you very much, Dr. John.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you very much, and thank you to our panelists. What a great start. It's really an honor to be hosting three great scholars when it comes to hydrocarbons and oil, the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, and beyond. And to your point, Jay, as I was growing up, I got to read a lot the contributions of Giacomo Luciani, a very well-known economist, and then I got to work for him and with him, and then he became in many ways a mentor. And then as I was growing up in my jobs, I used to write the excellent research produced by ÁdámSzymiński, who is currently the president of CAPSARC, an excellent institution that contributes greatly to the study of oil, and not just oil, and has done a tremendous job recently hosting the T20. And last but not least, Jim Crane, who I've known for many years, and now more recently, over the past few years, he has been writing a lot on oil, the future of oil, Saudi Arabia, energy markets. So it's really a unique opportunity we have with these three great scholars to tell us a little bit about where is oil going, what is the future of oil. This is not a session where we are going to predict the price of oil, nor are we going, I hope, not to tell you that this country is going to do badly and the other great. But this is more to put things in perspective and to take out the noise in many ways from all the things that we hear that suddenly oil is going to disappear. We peaked in oil demand and EVs are entering the market and all these countries are going to fall apart. This is far the case. We want to really bring the knowledge to the front and really analyze what is happening. And I want to give the opportunity to ÁdámSzymiński. Great honor, Adam, to have you. Please, you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John, and salam alaikum to all my friends in the region here. John, thank you for that very kind introduction, and I'd also like to say thank you to the Cambridge Middle East and North Africa Forum. This is, I think, well, I'm planning on having a good time tonight, and I hope there'll be a lot of questions. I'm looking at the clock now, and I promise to keep my remarks to 10 minutes. The purpose of the webinar, as I understood it, was to talk about the future of the oil market in light of supply and demand dynamics. And let me just start by saying, seems that the two or three biggest factors in the markets this year was first the impact of the COVID crisis on demand. And I think in general, the overall response of OPEC, the OPEC plus energy ministers, even the G20 actually got into the act on looking for ways to stabilize the oil markets in the aftermath of what I think most people believe is probably the greatest demand crisis that we've seen in a long time. There were estimates made recently that, and the numbers are still being tracked down that demand for petroleum on a global basis in April might have fallen by 20 million barrels a day. And we never had anything quite like that in 1 month. And at the same time, John, one of the other factors that I think we're dealing with is the increasing identification of climate change as an urgent global challenge. The scientific evidence seems pretty clear that man-made greenhouse gases are contributing to global warming, and efforts have been made over the past 2 decades, I think, actually, to try to figure out a way to manage greenhouse gases, including carbon dioxide, and pointing out the importance of collective mitigation and adaptation efforts. There have even been some people calling for a ban on hydrocarbons, and I don't know how we could actually have a discussion tonight without talking about, can we ban hydrocarbons? Or has the COVID crisis accelerated the trends that some people believe were already underway, moving towards renewables as a primary source of energy? I want to start off by saying that 80% of the world's energy supply is still coming from hydrocarbons. That number actually hasn't changed a whole lot in the last 2 decades, despite enormous efforts to try to use efficiency and renewables, wind, solar, and even biorenewables as a way to manage the climate effort. So in Saudi Arabia, and CAPSARC had a hand in this, but many institutions and companies in the kingdom have been working on this idea that we call the circular carbon economy. And circular carbon economy builds on the ideas of the circular economy. Most people know what that means. Let me come back to this idea of, again, the concept. Reduce the amount of carbon entering in the economy to begin with, and Saudi Arabia is not opposed to the idea of efficiency and renewables. The kingdom has a huge program underway for automobile efficiency, air conditioning efficiency, very important, particularly in the GCC, MENA region. The kingdom has pretty strict fuel efficiency standards for automobiles and has actually moved towards market pricing for gasoline, as an example. The largest green hydrogen project in the world is underway in the kingdom at NEOM. Aramco and SABIC have been working on blue hydrogen, turning the hydrogen into ammonia, shipping the green ammonia or blue ammonia outside of the kingdom, these kinds of things. Reducing the amount of carbon entering in the economy in the beginning is a great idea. Reusing carbon as an input to create valuable feedstocks and fuels is what reuse is about. Recycling through the natural carbon cycle. And then finally, removing excess carbon from the atmosphere. CAPSARC has worked with 5 very respected international organizations: the International Energy Agency, the International Renewable Energy Agency, Nuclear Energy Agency, the Global CCS Institute, and the OECD Policy Office to author a guide to the circular carbon economy. It's on www.cceguide.org. There's everything that you want to know about all of the technological options that we think are available are in there. The guide shows that there are problems in mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. It looks at some of the hard to abate sectors like aviation, shipping, steel, aluminum, cement, petrochemicals, and so on. It pushes the idea of trying to minimize stranded assets. It looks at an orderly transition, and it particularly looks at ways through regulatory and financial frameworks to try to push the technology associated with mitigating carbon dioxide. The CCE framework was actually endorsed by the G20 summit leaders, and I think that it is critical if we're really going to address CO2 in a practical way. And if we are going to see countries in the GCC region who have generally a high, in MENA, many countries with a high dependency on hydrocarbons as their economic base, finding a way to move in an orderly way towards a transition if we're going to see one, and in particular, making sure that if we do end up seeing maybe not even a decline in petroleum, but a plateau or an increase, that we have options to manage the emissions that will be coming from those fuels. I said I would take 10 minutes. I think that was 9, John. I'm going to give you back my minute, and I'm looking forward to questions and discussion after the rest of the panelists are have a chance to talk. So thank you, John.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. Wonderful. Thank you very much. A lot of things to discuss. Jim?
Hi. Well, thanks, John. Thanks, Adam. That was really interesting. Great stuff. Lots of food for thought there. And thanks to the MENA Forum for having me. It's great to be back in Cambridge, if only virtually. I've heard from sources in Cambridge that the city is actually, don't tell anybody, but it's better than ever without all the tourist hordes. I don't know. Not sure we can. Not sure it's okay to say that, but maybe some of the folks that are in town can clue me in in the Q&A. So I want to focus a little bit more narrowly. So I'm here in Houston, so I think it might be. I get it. It's maybe a little easier for me to talk about Saudi Arabia from here. And so I want to talk about Saudi Arabia, is where a lot of my research looks at, and how the kingdom might approach an oil market in decline. I'm not saying the oil market is going to decline, but as Adam said, we may see a plateau at some point in oil, and how might countries develop strategies to deal with that a plateau or decline? How might Saudi Arabia preserve its oil rent dominated economy and its nearly unique system of governance? Right, there aren't that many absolute monarchies left in the world, and most of those are based on oil rents. So this is a talk based on a couple of papers I've written recently and another one that's in progress. I hope it makes a good starting off point to look at how other producers might behave. So a few initial points. So Saudi Aramco, okay, the big national oil company in the kingdom, is the cheapest and the lowest carbon oil producer in the world at the moment, right? It's also the entity that provides the funding, most of the funding that keeps the Saudi royal family in power, right? So two really strategic roles, big roles. So Aramco executives and Saudi oil ministry officials have, over the past couple of years, made it pretty clear that Saudi Aramco is not going to be one of the firms that sort of bows out early from the oil business. It's not going to behave like some of the shareholder-owned IOCs that are becoming, IECs, sort of international energy companies, maybe bowing partly to social pressures, unless returns on oil fall to the point where the Saudi competitive advantage may not matter so much anymore. And that seems to be far off, right? So I see three important calculations behind Saudi Aramco's bid for longevity, right? So, and there's probably more, and I'd love to hear from everybody on this if there's other rationales for this. But the first one is that the regime survival, which is always the sort of the main driver, it seems to be in decision making, regime survival and external security for Saudi Arabia still remain reliant on regime control over oil rents, right? And replacing those rents, it's an ongoing process, but it's a long process and it's a pretty uncertain process, right? Second is that the risks to Saudi Arabia from a loss of those oil rents outweighs the risk of climate damage to the kingdom, I think, in the view of Saudi elites, at any rate, right? So, and I think the notion is that climate damage isn't going to go away if Saudi Arabia leaves the oil business and other firms continue to market oil, right? So, so it may not even, have a huge effect. Third, that even in a world that's serious about decarbonization and taking climate action, there's going to be long-term uses for oil that remain, including non-combustion uses for oil. So Saudi Arabia can, at least for now, present itself as the optimal producer for a climate-stressed world, given its low cost and low carbon intensity, right? So in another forum like this recently that Giacomo was presiding over, a bunch of us argued that Saudi Aramco could actually monetize that carbon advantage by declaring its intent to pursue carbon neutrality by 2050, and then maybe embarking on this competitive decarbonization race that it's already leading. So I'm happy to chat further about that in the discussion. But here I want to tease out how the Saudis might behave in a plateaued or in a declining oil market. So let's assume, just for our purposes here, that global oil demand shifts into a plateau and a slow decline, right? And that public opinion, global public opinion, and government policy continues to emphasize reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So, that decline in demand would probably force prices down, but we might still see some spikes in price and in demand because of underinvestment and other market actions, collusion among OPEC, et cetera. So oil demand and prices would still fall, but longer term trend would be down. So Saudi Arabia is the leader of OPEC. I see two broad strategies that it might pursue. Okay, so the first one is I call managed decline. The second one I'll talk about is sort of a market share strategy. So managed decline would kind of continue the collective action through OPEC of doling out oil production quotas that are used to keep oil prices higher. Sort of a soft landing strategy for big producers. It gives oil-dependent states, countries, more time to pursue economic diversification, more funds to pursue economic diversification, and OPEC might even use carbon intensity as one of the criteria for doling out its quotas for production. However, this managed decline strategy would imply a really a large long-term sacrifice from Saudi Arabia. It would mean ceding some market share to other OPEC members as well as free riders like U.S. shale, the big one. So over the short run, it might be advantageous. They might get a per barrel. The per barrel premium from reducing production might outweigh revenues lost from reducing exports. But longer term, Saudi Arabia you might see the kingdom's kind of forced into these continual cuts that wind up ceding market share to free riders. Probably would be untenable over the long term. And if we see a demand falling, collusion might actually get less and less profitable, right? It might only be worth doing when oil prices are really low, like they are now. Or so Saudi might instead prefer a market share oriented strategy. Okay, so and this would be sort of broadly sacrificing short-term rents to minimize stranded reserves, right, over the long term. It would require preparation, I would think, starting with more cash in the central bank. I'm sure John could talk about that. So Saudi Aramco would raise production under this scenario, drive down prices, and take market share from higher cost producers. It would probably continue to kind of wrest control over the value chain through refining and petchems to ensure that its reserves are monetized, so that that it can place those cargoes when and where it needs to. Would it have to leave OPEC to do this? Maybe in an extreme case, but probably not. I think it might be sufficient for the kingdom to pursue periodic bouts of low prices that aren't enough to force shut-ins, to force rival producers to actually shut in their production, but might be enough just to thwart new investment, to bring down the level of investment. And underinvestment might actually be Aramco's new ally in this market share quest. So you'd see Saudi production becoming the supply that replaces that loss to natural declines. So this market share strategy might actually have some other advantages, right? So if Saudi's market share does increase globally, it would boost its reinvigorate its geopolitical stature, right? Maybe only temporarily, but who knows for how long. We might see lower oil prices that would bring back a stronger global demand for oil. Oil might compete more handily with substitute fuels and technologies, EVs, et cetera. And climate policy might actually have to kind of be reformulated and push a little harder to do the work of reducing demand. So we might also see a more chaotic and competitive, certainly more competitive oil market, and it might even devolve into like dirty tricks. You might see countries, interfering into the domestic affairs of others, fomenting unrest or causing other kind of above ground problems that prevent rival producers from getting their crude to market. You might see, like we have especially under the Trump administration, lots of oil state lobbying in Washington for sanctions on rival producer countries, right? We've got, the U.S. has got sanctions on Iran, Venezuela, and Russia right now. We might see more of that kind of behavior or attempted behavior. So to finish up, how would this shake out? I mean, we don't know, but it probably would be a bit of oscillation. I think Saudi Arabia would kind of continue to do what it's doing now, oscillating between these two on it, using the price war to kind of shape the oil market in favorable ways, leaving OPEC probably maybe a step too far. I think it renders the kingdom maybe a little less able to pursue collective action when it needs to, right? So collusion still pays at a low oil price like we have now. But maybe a smaller OPEC might work, right? So maybe OPEC with Saudi, Russia, maybe Iraq might be enough. I think Adam may have done some work on this, and we've also seen it might require a bit more political control over Aramco. I think we've seen a little bit of that under King Salman, a little bit more increase of government control over Aramco. That's usually seen as a negative, but in this case, and I think Saudi's oil market strategy has gotten so geopolitical and may get even more geopolitical that it probably needs that strong political determination to it. And we're starting to see some of a little bit of shifting geopolitical alliances, maybe some big ones, right? So the new security ties with Israel, et cetera. We might see a bit more of those geopolitical shifts going on around the region among oil states, et cetera, if we see reduced strategic interest from Washington. So I'll leave it there and hand it back to John.
Great, Jim, fantastic. A lot of things to really mull over. I mean, thinking about the politics, but also the economics of energy, the dynamism that you described. I mean, obviously they'll have to take some really hard decisions going forward. The Saudis and everybody else involved in the decision-making circles. Giacomo.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Adam and Jim. I will start by saying that I think in any scenario of plateauing or decreasing oil demand, we need to take into account the likely behavior of prices. And that is very important. First of all, it is true that the COVID pandemic has caused a sharp decrease in oil demand, as Adam mentioned, but I share the skepticism about projecting this into the future and concluding that we have reached or we will reach a peak in oil demand anytime soon. I believe that some of the transformations brought about by the COVID pandemic will stay with us. Like, the habit of having conferences like this one, rather than traveling around the world for short meetings, or a combination of presential and remote instruction in higher education. I think that will remain, because in many ways it has proven to be productive and has had advantages. I think people will tend to travel less, use fewer planes. I think that is to be welcomed. But, by far, the vast majority of people in this world have never taken a plane, and they don't have access to internet. They probably don't have a computer. And all what we are talking about is something very much OECD centered. The industrial countries of this world have this opportunity of changing, evolving the way of doing business. But the vast majority of people in this world may not have access to electricity or clean cooking fuels. So for them, the equation is completely different. And for them, what matters is the price and availability of oil and fuels that are derived from oil. And price is important because in a scenario in which we have abundant supply and stagnating or more slowly growing demand, prices are likely to remain rather low. And that is extremely important in preventing a sudden or rapid change or decline in demand, because many people will find increasingly convenient to rely on oil. So yes, we may read that Boris Johnson is intending to ban the sale of internal combustion engines by 2035. But from here to concluding that demand for oil in the world will decline, there is a long way. So first of all, prices are important. Second, there are many oil producers, and not all of them are major oil exporters. And I think that too is a significant point. Certainly, the United States, of the three main oil producers in this world, the United States, Russia, and Saudi Arabia, the United States is basically perhaps reaching self-sufficiency in oil, but basically a domestic consumer of oil. And Russia is to a larger extent a domestic consumer of oil than Saudi Arabia. So it's mostly the exporters that face the problem of acceptance of oil and oil products in foreign markets. The rest are going to focus on perhaps domestic utilization, more domestic utilization, through the transformation of oil in other non-fuel products, either substitution of other existing sources. There are various maneuvers that one can think of. And, we see what happens in Germany. They finally achieved a consensus on phasing out coal only a year ago, more or less. And the deadline for doing that is 2038. So it is very difficult to kill a domestic sector. I don't expect Joe Biden to be, or anybody after him, to be able to pass in Congress a measure like banning the sale of internal combustion engines or banning the use of oil. because there is too much of a domestic constituency that would be hurt by that. And that is true in many countries, because oil is produced in many countries, not just in the major oil exporters. Today, approximately 60% of produced oil is traded internationally. What I can easily visualize is the fact that less oil will be traded internationally. More of it will be used domestically, transformed domestically into other products, either hydrocarbons not meant for fuel use, such as petrochemicals, or energy-intensive products, which can be produced out of hydrocarbons with carbon capture and sequestration, as Adam was mentioning. It is clear that oil producers in general have the best and cheapest opportunities to sequester CO2. And so it is logical to think in terms of energy-intensive industries moving towards those locations in which oil is produced and CO2 can be more easily stored. I think this is a broader consideration. At the moment, I don't see that governments have come to terms with the necessity of moving towards a different kind of division of labor in which energy-intensive industries are located close to energy sources, be they hydrocarbons or renewable energy sources, because the same can be said of renewable energy sources. They are not equally available everywhere in the world. There are certain locations in which renewable energy sources are more easily available, more conveniently available than in others. And this is, by the way, something that has been said by the Gulf oil producers that are also potentially major producers of renewable energy from sun and to some extent wind. So we need to accept that and this new division of labor, and I don't see much acceptance of it yet. And we have come out of a long period in which we had the ease of moving energy to where it was needed. You know, oil is very easily transported, so gas less so, electricity less so. But we have been accustomed to the notion that the availability of energy is not an important consideration in siting of industrial production. This inevitably will change, and oil and the location of industry will increasingly be affected by the availability of energy. So let's trade in general and a different division of labor. That's the broader context in which we need to reason. Coming now to specifically the Gulf oil producers, I think they have many ideal conditions to be in the forefront of this process. They can enhance local utilization of hydrocarbons, transformation of hydrocarbons into other products with carbon capture and sequestration, as Adam has already said. And in that sense, as Jim has already recalled, I organized a small debate with several people intervening, asking the question, should Gulf major national oil companies in the Gulf aim at carbon neutrality, announce a target of reaching carbon neutrality by 2050? And the answer was unanimous, yes, they should announce such a target because they are in best positions to actually achieve this target they're in a better position than anybody else in the world. So they should be leading in this front. Now, having said that, the combination of these different factors, relatively low prices of oil, the need to invest very heavily in a transformation, in accelerating a transformation that in some cases has been going on for decades, but needs to be accelerated, investing very heavily in the transformation of the energy sector and the industrial sector to put in place an economy that is both clean from the point of view of energy and environment and capable of exporting a wide array of energy-intensive products, that requires a very significant economic effort. And as Jim was mentioning, the task of the national oil companies of the oil-producing countries is both to enhance the value of their resources, but also to support their government financially, because these states are heavily reliant or exclusively reliant on the oil rent. And the oil rent will be reduced because of the lower prices, and probably also the higher costs implicit in having to sequester the CO2, in having to transform locally into acceptable, internationally acceptable products. And also there is a need to shift much bigger resources towards investment from current expenditure. So there are major challenges ahead for the governments of the oil-producing countries. Is this going to be a political challenge? I think so. I think the so-called rentier social pact is more solid than many people believe. But undoubtedly, there is need for a transformation and increased involvement of broader and broader sectors of society into the process of governing and putting in place this transformation. That's all I have to say. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Giacomo. Thank you very much. A lot of things. I don't know where to start. Jay, I wanted to ask you, are there specific questions that members are asking? Because I don't see them online live, at least from my side. Or shall I go ahead and start probing into everything that was said?
I think it would be good if maybe you probed for a few minutes and then we could go to questions. To ask questions, and this is for everyone listening, it would be very helpful if you could click raise hand. And once you do so, John can call on you, and then you can unmute yourself, ask, and then we can proceed like that, if that makes any sense.
Yes, thank you, Jay. And I apologize for the background noise by one of our members.
Yes, they've been summarily removed.
Yes, very good. I was not able to get everything. So I want to start by saying, what in your opinion, Adam, do you think is feasible over the next 10 years, given where we are in the energy market, as to what is feasible in terms of the balance between energy, carbon sequestration, and then the demand on the oil producers to be more energy conscious? Is it feasible to move along the Paris Accord, the Paris agreements, versus what everybody else wants to see the oil producing countries do and deliver?
John, I think that's a really interesting question. I won't try to predict what oil companies are going to do, but I think the idea of companies, again, using based on their own national circumstances and the resource base they have available, and their ability to do research and development and finance that will take different paths. But many companies, including Saudi Aramco, are looking very closely at ESG, environment, social governance issues, and the idea of setting some kind of targets for moving towards carbon neutrality or net zero is important. Let me just, by the way, say that certainly for Saudi Arabia, it's very important to think about this as a net or balancing item. There are a lot of people that talk about zero carbon, and carbon's not the enemy. I mean, you're made of carbon, and we breathe carbon dioxide. The biocycle is very heavily involved in CO2. We have Jim McDonough, who's a very well-known circular economy advocate, has talked about three kinds of carbon. And there's living carbon, there is carbon that moves in the material cycles, and there is fugitive carbon. Fugitive carbon is the problem. And so what we want to do is deal with the fugitive carbon. So then I come back to companies, I think, ultimately have to have the support of governments, some sort of, even in the Paris Agreement, Article 6 envisions the concept of companies being able to make arrangements for trading in a transparent and clear way of carbon, so that those people who have the ability to sequester it can get credit for that, and those who have the ability to pay for things like green ammonia or blue ammonia can get credit for their targets. We don't want to double count, but there has to be some way to make this work. I think that coming back to what can really be done, there is a program underway in the kingdom now to create a circular carbon economy national framework. And the idea will be to look for ways to measure the carbon from and greenhouse gases from different sources, to be able to set performance indicators, to begin to make progress towards reducing fugitive emissions, and to do so in a way that makes sense given the circumstances in Saudi Arabia. That, I think, actually was the beauty of what the G20 ministers agreed to. I think what they said was, look, we know that efficiency and renewables are the most important. Most countries, most of the carbon management projects are efficiency, and increasingly investment is going into renewables. Even in the kingdom, most of the impact in terms of carbon reduction now comes from efficiency. More of it over time will come from fuel switching. But what the G20 minister said is, let's leave the field open. Let's let the market try to figure out what the best technology is. And I think that the companies need to find ways to begin to demonstrate the different technologies. And what we really need, just as an example, and then I'll stop, is direct air capture, depending on whose numbers you believe, might cost more than $500 a ton. And it's got to get down to 50. If it gets down to 50, then you're in business. Then you kind of go, well, how are you ever going to do that? And the answer is you begin to experiment and you begin to scale up. And if you went back 20 years and you said that solar and wind were going to be as competitive economically as they are now, most people wouldn't have believed you. But I'm back to this very simple theme of we need to enable all of the options if we're really going to make progress on this. And I think the companies have to be able to show that they are serious in making serious investments and strides towards accomplishing these goals. Thanks.
Great. No, thank you. Thank you very much. Jim, I really was fascinated listening to some of the challenges or maybe issues that you see Aramco facing, if I were to place it in that framework, and also in general how the state in Saudi Arabia will have to rethink of its maybe larger role that ties into what Giacomo was saying about the rentier state and that. I wanted to ask you, are we thinking of a new sort of Aramco that needs to unfold in the coming 10 years as we think about the future of energy, oil, Saudi Arabia? You talked about the new possible alliance with Israel. A lot has been said, more will be said in the future. How do we put all these things in our thinking? I really love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's sort of, for lack of a better word, some musings, I think. Some of this is musings, but it's based on what Aramco's doing. I mean, they seem like they're moving pretty quickly into into these directions, trying to protect, the kingdom's system of governance by providing rents and trying to roll with the with changes in global public opinion and changes in technology, trying to promote ones that it sees as strategic and that can prolong the lifespan of oil in the global economy, but also diversifying into ones that at least the sovereign wealth fund might be diversifying into things that don't use oil, right? Buying shares in companies that might be looked upon as kind of competitors for oil. So I think the thinking at Aramco and in the ministry, and I'm sure it's backed by both of the other main speakers. Actually, all three of you, have significant advisory roles on this stuff. So, it's they seem to be doing the right things, I think, from the kingdom's perspective, to kind of preserve its well-being, working towards diversification, but understanding that diversification is not going to bring in the types of rents that they're used to. I mean, Saudi Arabia, if you look at their bond perspective, their cost of production is it's like $7.50 a barrel, including capital investment costs, right? So it's just that they're not going to get the same level of profits that they're used to. So they need to not just diversify in other economic sectors, but diversify the way the government funds itself, and they're doing that. They're moving into taxation, and they're sort of enabling that by opening up socially, right? So there's lots of social policy openings that are happening, closing down a bit in terms of free speech. How much that is an overstep and how much of that is necessary, I'll leave to others. But there's lots of pieces to this. If they see the U.S. especially moving away from oil and becoming less dependent on their supply, but maybe less, if oil starts to lose its monopoly on transportation, then they've got a strategic problem. They've got a kind of a hard security issue if the United States becomes less interested. No evidence of that happening, really. The U.S. still has 60,000 troops stationed in and around the Gulf. But there's sure a lot of talk about it, right? So, Foreign Affairs, the big foreign policy journal, has had some pretty serious articles by serious thinkers saying that, look, we can go back, the U.S. can go back to, this sort of over the horizon defense posture in the Gulf. We don't need to be spending $100 billion plus a year protecting, Saudi Arabia and the other oil kingdoms there. And if that happens, the Saudis will need, if their strategic importance to the United States or to the world declines, they're going to need to make alternate arrangements. I think we're seeing that happen with them and with the UAE. They're both getting more interventionist around the region, developing alternate alliances. This partnership with Israel is an interesting one. I'm sure it's got some hard security protection aspects to it. I would argue the UAE's nuclear power foray into nuclear power is partly driven by strategic security concerns, right? I mean, I think that the U.S. and other powers would consider a downfall of the regime in Abu Dhabi to be a big problem if there's a danger of proliferation beyond just potential loss of oil supply to the global economy. So I think these countries they're already moving. I think fairly quickly for the the size of these operations to try and shore up their longevity and the longevity of their regimes.
Thank you, Jim. No, it's very interesting. I do tend to see that the Israeli element has some of these basic dynamics of some kind of an alliance, and however, I'm still not sure if the Israelis understand what they're getting into, as the Americans are exiting, not yet physically, as I completely agree with you, but mentally and probably psychologically, they're exiting from the region, and then the Israelis are thinking, or they should be thinking, what are we getting into? Because then probably Saudi and the UAE will think of replacing them as the missing gap, or not. It remains to be seen. But that moves to Giacomo. Giacomo, you have been pondering away while Jim has been thinking. And I wanted to, ask you, are we now in an era of not just the new social contract, but a very new fiscal contract that all of these countries in the Gulf, and unavoidably we're talking about the Gulf and predominantly Saudi Arabia, as most of us have done a lot of our careers in Saudi Arabia, working and thinking about Saudi Arabia. Maybe less in your case, but for sure in my case, and now in Adam's case, and of course Jim, but it's unavoidable not to think about Saudi Arabia. But are we now in a new era? The social contract is slowly waning, and now we have a new fiscal reality. What is the region going to be facing? Notwithstanding what you said, which I also agree, by all means, that oil is not going to disappear, and the doomsday scenario that oil demand just disappears and suddenly EV is going to replace it. My big question is, when they talk about electric vehicles, especially in the UK, they're not doing yet the thinking behind the infrastructure. It requires an enormous amount of infrastructure just to have the plug-ins and just to have the necessary requirements. And how are we going to generate this electricity that everybody is thinking about? We're just not going to do it overnight. Giacomo, what are your thoughts?
On electric vehicles?
Well, not only, and also about the contract. You said the rentier state will very much stay, but the elements of the social contract, the fiscal contract.
Yes, well, the two topics are quite different. On the rentier state and the fiscal future of the Gulf countries, you need to distinguish between the situation of at least three countries, Kuwait, Qatar, and I would say Abu Dhabi, potentially the UAE, but it's Abu Dhabi. These are countries, in the case of Abu Dhabi, an emirate, that have sufficiently small populations and sufficiently large oil resources that they can think in terms of accumulating large sovereign wealth funds, which will possibly generate enough revenue to support their respective states, especially if they progressively get rid of the huge expatriate population that they have, you know, so they can shrink and survive on the basis of their financial heritage. Okay, Saudi Arabia does not belong to this category because it's a country of a certain size, a population of a certain size, and the simple accumulation of financial assets will not suffice. So in the dilemma, in the alternative between industrial and financial diversification, financial diversification is not sufficient for solving or guaranteeing the future of Saudi Arabia. Now, we have been seeing a good deal of financial diversification so far. The decision to privatize Saudi Aramco, even only 5% of it, is a decision that has the meaning of acquiring a market capitalization, a measure of market capitalization for this company, and therefore allowing it to become an asset in the portfolio of a sovereign wealth fund, PIF, and Saudi Aramco has been now located in the portfolio of PIF. We see contradictory decisions, frankly, coming from Saudi Arabia in these times, because on the one hand, yes, there is all the emphasis on maintaining the future of oil and continuing in the line of industrial diversification that has been pursued ever since the process of development planning started. And that's very much what, also Adam was saying before. So there is this line of thinking. At the same time, we see certain decisions, such as a recent decision to maintain the level of dividend from Saudi Aramco in making it possible by borrowing on the market. That's a kind of behavior that you may expect from companies that are widely traded and need to take care of the fidelity of their shareholders, but configures a threat that has always been there and much ventilated about national oil companies. That is, that they may become cash cows and not be allowed to maintain a sufficient share of their surplus for their own investment, okay? And that, so when I read that Saudi Aramco is cutting back on investment and borrowing in order to maintain the level of dividend payments, I am worried, okay? The problem with the fiscal future is that you need to have a credible fiscal base, that is a base that you may tax. And at the moment, what we have seen is a tripling of VAT in Saudi Arabia, which is a needed and positive measure. But VAT is a consumption tax, and obviously consumption is an available base for taxation in the kingdom. But you cannot indefinitely increase consumption taxes, first of all, because they become inflationary, and second, because they are highly regressive from the point of view of income distribution. So you need to accompany consumption taxes with taxes on income and wealth and taxes on corporations. But today, there is not an independent private sector that is capable of becoming a significant source of income for the state. There has been words about empowering the private sector and relying more on the private sector, but the deeds have been rather in the opposite direction, including the decision to ask Saudi Aramco to buy SABIC. SABIC is a company that has been a candidate for privatization, full privatization, for the past 40 years, okay? And in the end, it was not privatized, it was renationalized under the aegis of Saudi Aramco. So there are many positive developments in the kingdom, but there are also contradictory signals that make me worry about the future. In addition, you know, I do believe that it is not possible to evolve towards greater reliance on taxation without, at the same time, accepting greater participation on the part of broader strata of the population.
Let me try a really quick answer to that. If you go on our website, capsarc.org, you can find something called the COMO, CapSarc Oil Market Outlook. Mark Finley actually helps out on that. Maybe Mark would have a comment on this. We believe that oil demand in 2022 will actually be higher than it was in 2019. So we'll see a recovery in oil demand on a global basis. If I had to, you know, looking at forecasts from organizations like the Energy Information Administration, which I used to head in Washington, I think it's a pretty reliable, not too partisan, you know, independent, pretty objective organization. They'd say sometime, you know, around 2040, maybe it plateaus. But the idea that it's has already peaked and is going to fall, I don't believe. And a final comment, if I'm wrong and it has peaked and it is going down in 2040, we're still going to have 60 million barrels a day of oil demand, then somebody's going to have to produce that, and Saudi Arabia will be one of the countries producing it.
Yeah.
I think, if I may step in, I think the answer depends on whether you believe that income per capita differences in the world will continue to narrow down as have done over the past decades, and the difference between the United States and top rich countries and the poorer countries have been narrowing. If that continues, I don't think we are going to see peak oil anytime soon, because the emerging countries are interested in economic development, in economic growth, and they will be using oil. It's extremely difficult to envisage that they might do that without making use of hydrocarbons. If, on the contrary, you believe that the 600 million people who have no access to electricity in Africa will stay without access and will stay without clean cooking facilities and so on and so forth, then yes, I mean, we are rich. We can afford to move away from oil, and we will, but it's a problem for the rest of the world.
Jim.
Well, gosh, I always try to avoid these kind of questions, but and you know, I have taken sort of a quick look at some of these different forecasts for when oil is going to peak, and they range from, you know, a year ago to 2050, right? So really broad range. But there's an interesting thing about them, right? So the bullishness of the forecast seems to be linked to the you know, the main economic activity in the place that produces it, right? Whether it's a company or a region or a country or the thrust of the organization that produces it, right? So so how reliable these things are, I mean, some of them, you know, the ones that are produced by companies seem to be, you know, they seem to be making these predictions to perhaps, maybe even, not on purpose, right? But to try and validate a business plan that's already been put in place, right? So if you're bullish on crude, you know, Exxon's a prediction is going to look different than if you're trying to validate, you know, BP's trying to validate its investments away from oil, right? So so there's a broad range. I don't know who's right. I mean, you know, there's, you know, 6 billion people in the developing world now, and you know, roughly you know, 1.5 in the developed world. So that's a pretty big number. You know, so it would seem that you know, if they start, as economies grow, they'll start using, you know, they'll start wanting to to move around the earth, and they'll also start consuming more plastic. So, so I suppose I would weigh in on a later, that, you know, that oil has not peaked yet, and maybe it'll peak at the end of the decade, or you know, sometime beyond that. I mean, the other part about this is so difficult is government policy, you know, in 190 countries is so hard to predict, and it kind of swings back and forth. I mean, we're seeing global public opinion harden every year. The Pew survey numbers get bigger and bigger for the places that the countries where concern is growing about climate change and about the need for action. That hasn't yet corresponded with oil demand, but, you know, we may have seen peak coal. Coal may have peaked, right? I mean, it's you know, it looks like it's plateaued. So, you know, it's possible that it'll come, but I don't know. I can't say when.
Well, let me add to the confusion here, Jay, that I think this is all motivated by the fact that we're looking at numbers in the OECD world, predominantly in the US, and some of the very fancy Nordic countries that have decided to go EV. And the often quoted country, Sweden, is used as an example that electric vehicles are being bought in massive numbers, and they are having these fantastic deals. And the Swedes are leading the way. But I'm yet to be surprised that in Nigeria, they're still buying normal cars. And Nigeria 10 years from now will be a country of 400 million people or thereabout. And India is just getting around buying cars. And China still is buying predominantly cars that have an internal combustion engine. This is not to say that Toyota has not decided to produce EVs from 2030 onwards, and the UK will have only EVs dominating the scene. But there are more cars to be sold in emerging markets over the next 10 years than electric vehicles put together in the US and Europe. And I think this is the disconnect. We are being dominated by a one-sided view, which is the OECD view. So I don't think that oil demand is going to disappear, but it's being emotionally guided by COVID and the blurriness created by the disinterest to buy cars in the first few months of 2020, given that the world is motivated by what's happening in the OECD world. Africa is not facing the same kind of pandemic that Europe and the US is facing. Southeast Asia and the Far East is not facing the kind of pandemic that we're facing. And there are very different ways to look at this. So I think we are observing this from an OECD-dominated view, going back to Giacomo's point. And I think there is more legroom for the oil market than what meets the eye today. I think that's where I will put myself in this. I mean, there are more oil traders today, and compared to 10 years ago, the oil market is still dominating. And you look at options and futures, that's a huge business for any trading desk if you are in an investment bank and if you are in Goldman Sachs.
Hi. I'm a postdoc research with Rice University. I'm actually doing some research with Jim right now, looking at when OPEC is able to collude. So I just have a game theory model, a repeated prisoner's dilemma game effectively. And I'm modeling it out at different scenarios. So like how much global demand is there and what's the base price that we're looking at. And my research is sort of consistently finding that as price decreases and as global demand decreases, both of those trends result in it being easier for OPEC to collude. So the theoretical limits on rent from collusion increase as both of those factors go down. So a big takeaway from this is as we do this energy transition, as prices drop and demand drops, OPEC is going to be an increasingly powerful player in the global oil markets. And I wanted to know if does that seem in line with other people's research?
Let me just mention that CAPSARC has done research on the issue of does the spare capacity and the use of spare capacity by OPEC add economic value on a global basis, and the findings in the peer-reviewed Energy Journal are that it does, that the ability of OPEC to help stabilize and reduce the volatility in oil prices actually has a positive net economic value to the global economy of something like $200 million a year. First study we did on that was in 2018. We had data through 2014. We updated that just this year with data through 2019 with the same findings, basically. I had to laugh. I think that you probably get more people to read your study if you use the word other than collusion. I'll go back to our study. Our study shows that the use of spare capacity and OPEC's ability to add to or remove oil from the market has actually had a positive net economic benefit. There's a different connotation in that than collusion, which implies market manipulation, in my view. So I don't, that's kind of a view that's, I mean, I'm obviously is informed by a lot of years being involved in this business and the work that CAPSARC did in these studies that are available on our website if you want to go see. I don't know,
Peter, have you
John,
seen
back
that?
to you if somebody else wants to jump in.
I wanted to see if Peter, I think we took a look. I know I've read that. That's Axel's paper. I think you're talking about. He was the lead author on that. Axel Piru.
Yeah.
I kind of referenced your modeling in my remarks, so maybe before you got on, but you've taken a look at that paper, haven't you?
Yeah,
sure,
absolutely. Right? Yeah.
Yeah. You might have missed some of the beginning of the discussion, but were you here for the previous question about when the market might peak and some of the caveats about that?
Yeah, and so to allude to Adam's points, like having a lower volatility on your oil prices is going to make it easier for consumers to buy it. And so as OPEC continues to collude more moving forward, we're going to see prices that are low, supply that's easy to access, and then prices that are stable. So it's going to become a more attractive fuel moving forward, especially for people in the developing world. The stability of the prices is sort of what allowed oil to come in and be this forefront of transportation fuel at the beginning, like when it was competing with whale fuel oil and stuff like that.
Stabilizing the markets and reducing volatility is not easy. And one of the concerns that I have is that what you're seeing in the oil companies in terms of reduction in capital spending, difficulty in borrowing, difficulty in floating equity could result in a shortfall in production that may show up in 2022, 23, sometime, that makes the markets hard to manage. My experience again in being an oil analyst literally since the 1970s is that there are cycles, and the cycles are hard to control, and that you have periods of overshooting and undershooting of a market-based equilibrium point, and that we have to be careful of that. So one of the just last comment, and usually I talk about these cycles in the sense of, you often go to meetings and you'll hear somebody being introduced. Oh, so and so has 25 years experience in the markets, or what have you, and I like to say I've got about 7 years experience, but 6 times.
Wow.
In general, if I may step in here, maintaining discipline within OPEC is not easy for a long period of time. OPEC reacts very effectively when faced with a crisis. The collapse of prices, that is something that focuses everybody's minds. But as soon as the situation improves, doubts emerge, and you have to keep in mind that it is much more likely that production will increase out of a number of countries than the reverse. Libya, thanks God, is improving and is producing significantly more than it did only a few months ago. The situation in Iran after the election of Joe Biden has a chance, an opportunity to improve. It's certainly not a given, but that's the possible direction of change. And the same is known about Russia. Some of the major companies in Russia have never really accepted this kind of situation, and Russia has not been implementing the cuts in full. So you can see that there is an inevitable drift in a direction, and that is what we have seen time and again. And sooner or later, Saudi Arabia will say enough is enough, and they will start a new price war, and then the price will collapse. Everybody's mind will focus again, and you know that's the nature of the game. It's not a game to be easily implemented on a consistent basis. It goes through a repetition of crisis.
It's a blunt instrument, that price war. You know, it hurts everybody.
It is, but you know, we have seen many instances of it being used, and I think we'll see more because it's extremely difficult to maintain discipline within OPEC.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to maintain discipline among 24 countries anywhere, right? Especially when they're all sacrificing. I mean, they're all making, you know, taking these actions that are contrary to their national interests, you know, for the alleged greater good. And if they see that greater good being whittled away, then it's tough. I mean, it's always a tough call to do that. I think it's impressive that they can do it at all.
Oh yeah. I mean, you know, you can read the situation as being a glass half full rather than half empty, but it's not completely empty. There is not an authority that is capable of really maintaining discipline within such a group, unless you reach the point when the Saudis decide to punish everybody.
Great, thanks, Jay. And just to echo what Jay said earlier, thank you everyone for what's been a talk full of a massive amount of interesting information. I'm an undergraduate at Cambridge. I do Middle Eastern studies and specific interest in Iran. So my questions regarding that. And it's about the potential impact of a Biden deal with Iran, what that means for OPEC and also oil generally. And also, can we expect to see that being a significant source of pressure from the Gulf countries on Biden not to do a generous deal with Iran, allowing them to start releasing oil again or not? So really just about the potential impact of that. And that's for anybody on the panel. Thank you.
I mean, I can give you a few quick thoughts if I may. You know, it doesn't seem, well, until a couple of days ago, it probably wasn't on the top of Biden's agenda, right? You know, he's got a few other items that are probably going to take that are going to consume him when he comes in. But I would suspect that enforcing the sanctions on Iran, that the Biden administration, even in the absence of a deal, there might be a little less emphasis on enforcing those sanctions. So you might see more oil leaking out, you know, unofficially from Iran. So there might be a bit more coming to market. Making the deal is going to be tough. It's been made a lot tougher by this alleged, you know, this assassination apparently by Israel of this nuclear scientist. I think that's getting, you know, there's going to be some repercussions from that, unfortunately, that already seem to be happening. And you know, at some point, if this kind of behavior keeps up, I mean, I think Iran, you know, probably across the board politically in Iran, they're going to see that they're going to keep having this sort of suffering these kinds of attacks until they get a nuclear deterrent. So I think this kind of behavior is like pushing them even further towards you know, going nuclear, developing a nuclear weapon. So I think it's unfortunate, but maybe Biden can interrupt that process. But I know there's many other things on his agenda that may take precedence unless, you know, we start to see more of these things, you know, these unfortunate events, attacks, etc.
I think your question was, how will the Biden administration, you know, what kind of energy policy will they follow? Biden is a pretty moderate, I think, in many ways, and is certainly his campaign platform indicated that moderation relative to other candidates like Bernie Sanders, for example. And I think I'd just point out that the United States and Saudi Arabia have had a pretty strong relationship for the period that goes all the way back to the 1940s. And like any relationship that spans that length of a period of time, there are ups and downs. But I think that the U.S. Still has lots of reasons to want to remain engaged in this region. And just as one example, there was a lot of talk 5 years ago, 10 years ago, that we were going to be energy independent, and that would mean that we didn't have to have any worries at all about what was happening in the Middle East. And that's obviously proven to be a very poor forecast. The United States has many reasons that go beyond just oil or imported oil to remain engaged in the MENA region in general. This is the MENA Forum for Cambridge, and I suspect that that engagement will continue through a Biden presidency, just as it did through Trump and Obama and Bush before him, and through many other presidents across a very long period of time.
Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting answers.
Thank you for your question, Marcus.
Great. Well, I think we've exceeded our time. Thank you to our speakers who stuck with us after the event technically ended. And thank you, of course, to everyone who was listening in. This has been extremely educational for me, and I'm sure everyone else can say the same. So thanks again. And yeah, thank you to John for moderating, and thank you to everyone who asked questions. And see you at our future events. You can find them all at cmenaf.org, and of course on social media as well, so on and so forth. And that's all. So thank you very much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your week.